All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our 13th installment of the Wild at Work Stewardship series. It is my pleasure today to present Dr. Sarah Fritts, an associate professor and first woman wildlife ecologist in the biology department at Texas State University. Dr. Fritz's research program in wildlife ecology focuses on combining innovative field and analytical approaches to find practical solutions that balance the requirements of wildlife with the socioeconomic needs of humans. Specifically, she is exploring sustainable land use practices with a particular focus on renewable energy ecology. Since arriving at Texas State, much of her research has focused on the unintended consequence of bats being killed by wind turbines by exploring ways to decrease fatalities and better understand bat phenology. She has recently been collaborating with the National Renewable Energy Lab, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and various private energy and consulting companies, and has collaborated on wildlife research conducted in Africa, Ecuador, Europe, Malaysia, Borneo, across the continental United States, and Hawaii. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Fritts.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Let me try to share my screen. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can. Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, give me 1 second while I share this. Okay, there we go.
Okay, we're not seeing anything just yet, Dr. Fritz.
Let's try that again. I think I might have to be a co-host again. Sorry, it popped me off for some reason. Maybe it'll let me share. Okay.
Okay, you should be all set now.
Okay. My apologies. Okay. Can everyone see just the screen?
We can. You might want to go into presenter mode.
Okay. So it is on that. Yeah, it showed up on my other one. Okay.
Oh.
I don't know why it does that sometimes. Hold on 1 second. All those things that I can't work Zoom, right? Okay. I don't know why it's doing that. Let me just change the monitor here. Oh, I don't know why. Okay. I'll just share my other screen. That will probably fix the issue. My apologies, everybody. Okay. Now, that should do it.
Perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. Thanks for coming again. Thanks for having me. As was mentioned, I'm Dr. Sarah Fritts at Texas State University. And today I'm going to talk to you about the unintended consequences of intelligent tinkering, revisiting renewable energy resources to benefit biodiversity. That's quite the mouthful, but I hope by the end of this you kind of see the ties that I'm bringing together here. So yes, most of the talk is going to focus on bats and wind energy. Before we get there, I have a couple questions for you. So first, we're all here because we have some sort of value with wildlife, right? We value wildlife probably differently. Every person does. And we might value different species differently as well. So I want to ask you, how do you value wildlife? And to think about if you value different species differently and why. And what has come through your learning process and through growing up in different areas with different types of mentors, and how that has basically influenced your values that you set for wildlife species and wildlife in general. So here we have a picture of a lot of different species. And I will say that likely a lot of people value these different species quite differently here in Texas and other places as well. And historically, there's been a lot of values that have been placed on wildlife. So when settlers first came to the US, it was a largely valued commercially. And unfortunately, that led to a lot of demise of wildlife populations. But other commonly focused on values of wildlife include aesthetic, scientific, ecological, game, and intrinsic. And again, every person might have a mix of these values and have it for different species. For me, I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, so I did not grow up hunting and fishing. I do now, but growing up I didn't. But I always had some sort of an intrinsic value for wildlife. So this is a very fuzzy picture of me as a Daisy Scout, I think, or a Brownie Scout, holding some sort of pet snake. I probably ran right towards it as my young colleagues kind of looked at me like I was nuts. And this continued throughout my entire life where not very long after this, I had my own little rehab center on my back porch. I had a pet sitting company by the age of 5. And I always just had animals around, much to the demise of my parents, because I was the kid that came home with frogs and snakes in the pockets, and had them all over the house. But maybe you don't have the same values, and that's completely fine. But I want you to also think, what do you feel or how do you value when you see a bat? Like, what are the things that you think about when you hear bats? A lot of people, I think of disease. They think that bats fly around in their hair. They think that they smell bad. And unfortunately, because of this, bats have gotten a really bad rap through history and somewhat still to today. However, there's a lot of new research that's being conducted over the past probably decade or so that has proven a lot of these things to be incorrect. And also, value systems are starting to change around bats, which is fantastic. We're doing a lot more research. We're realizing their worth to the ecosystem and also to humans. And now we're having a lot of conservation measures that are being put into place, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. So when it comes to value systems, one person really changed a lot of the value systems or in North America, and that was Aldo Leopold. And I put this up here because he has a big influence on the title of today's talk. But one of the things that he mentioned is just a change of value systems. So I mention this a lot to students because you're allowed to change through time. You're allowed to learn and progress. And he did just that through Thinking Like a Mountain. If you haven't read it, I highly suggest it. Obviously, kind of the wildlife Bible. This is the father of wildlife management in the United States. Our Bible is the Sand County Almanac. But Thinking Like a Mountain is one of my favorite essays where he actually used to conduct predator control. So he would shoot wolves, thinking that it would increase game populations. And then one time he shot a wolf and he actually walked over to it and saw it die. And right then and there, he kind of changed his value system on wolves. And that was kind of the beginning of his land ethic value system. So basically valuing everything as a whole. And one of my favorite quotes of his is to keep every cog in wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. So even if the society doesn't value bats quite to the level of maybe white-tailed deer or some other species that have monetary value that has been noticed for a very long time, I think this is really smart that until we really understand it, we should probably keep it around because it likely has a intended purpose for ecosystems. So if we think about what we're doing right now, obviously humans are driving a lot of species to extinction. We are about to actually put another species, actually a bat species that resides here in Texas, on the Endangered Species Act. That is due to white nose syndrome, which I'm going to discuss just a little bit later. And I think that 1 million species is probably quite conservative. This was a report that came out a few years ago where we have been dubbed that we're living in the Anthropocene. Basically, every place on the planet has been touched by humans at this point, and agriculture and climate change have been noted as two of the biggest threats to wildlife populations. And of course, bats are are some of those that are being affected as well. So as mentioned in the introduction, I've done a lot of research on wildlife conservation on anthropogenic landscapes. So it's not only bats and wind energy. I actually started renewable energy ecology through reptiles, amphibians, and small mammals back in the eastern United States. But upon moving to Texas, this was the big need here. But I've also worked on a lot of timber lands, agricultural lands, and other things as well. But here in Texas, one of the big issues is that bats are unintentionally being killed by wind turbines. So that's what we'll start to talking about bats. Gone with the Wind. I have to say that because my grandmother lives off Terra Boulevard. I'm actually from really close to Jonesboro, so grew up right there where Gone with the Wind was. But implications of renewable energy on bat populations. And this is a picture of thermal imaging actually that we have of bats flying around a meteorological tower, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes as well. So why bats in Texas? Well, we all know that renewable energy is expanding and expected to continue rapid growth in the next several years under the current administration, which is great. We need to curb climate change, and it's one of the biggest mitigating measures to do so. Renewables became the second most prevalent U.S. electricity source in 2020, and that's largely from wind, which is mostly from Texas, although solar is catching up. And when I say mostly from Texas, wind energy. Like Texas has is leading in wind energy production, 3 times more than the next state down. And if it were its own country, it'd be the 5th largest producer in the world. So we have a lot of wind turbines here in Texas, with many more going up every single day. Okay, so let's switch from what we know about renewables to what we know about bats. Well, obviously we know that bats fly into your hair, they're blind, most of them have rabies, they're pretty much just flying rodents, and they drink blood. Well, you know, when I show this slide, a lot of times I get a few snickers, but unfortunately a lot of people still think all of these things, and none of these things are true. But these myths have gotten bats a really bad rap throughout human history, and they've been associated with disease and destruction. And this is a poster from a play that's called The Bat. When it flies, someone dies. So this is still what a lot of people think when it comes to bats, and that matters because if society doesn't value bats, then we don't have a lot of money for research and understanding of their natural history or how to conserve their populations. So obviously, I think all of us that value wildlife here are pretty used to having to bust myths for a lot of people that don't fully understand wildlife populations. And again, knowledge can change value systems. So it's really important, since a lot of our funding and stuff comes from the public monies. Okay, so what do we actually know about bats? Well, here in Texas, we have some of the greatest diversity of bats in the United States, or at least almost all are insectivores, although we do have a report of one vampire bat here in Texas, but most eat insects. There's been about 31, 32 species reported in Texas, and this is a picture of just 6, but you can see from this picture just the wide variety of morphological characteristics, which make them adapted to specific habitats, different feeding patterns, and live in different areas of the state. When it comes to rabies, only about 0.1% of bats in the wild carry the disease, so it's pretty low prevalence actually. Bats are not at all associated with rodents. They're actually more related to carnivores and even humans than they are with rodents, and they are if you know what R-selected and K-selected, they're more of a K-selected species, which means that they're slower to reproduce. They usually have only 1 to 2 pups per year. There's a couple species that can have up to 4, but usually only 1 to 4 or 1 to 2 pups a year. Yes, the young are called pups. And they're long-lived. A lot of people think more like rodents, that they die after a few years, but the oldest bat that we know about is a small myotis, similar to something that we'd see in Texas, that lives in Eastern Europe, and it's been estimated that it was like 56 years old. So they are long-lived, and they have a lot of communication as well. So they're not blind, they do see, but they also use echolocation to communicate and to orient themselves and navigate in the dark. And some bats' echolocation is so specific, so they send out these ultrasonic frequencies that bounce off of objects in their flight path. Some are so specific that they can tell what species of moth it is bouncing off of to know if that's one of their preferred species of prey or not. Bats also, again, have in their communication, they have individual recognition. They talk to each other, and bat pups actually have been noted to babble, similar to human babies. So the purpose of babbling is basically just saying like 3 syllables in a row, da da da, ba ba ba. And the purpose of that is thought to practice communication or to tell a parent that they need something without being extremely annoying. And it's been shown that bat pups actually do a similar type of communication. So they're really interesting animals. But for a lot of people, that's not enough. They want to know the economic value of bats. It is estimated that bats save farmers here in Texas millions, if not billions of dollars every single year. They do predate upon 2 of the main agricultural pests for corn, or for cotton, but also for corn. And they eat a lot of other agricultural pests as well. So they're not only eating those pests, they're actually decreasing the need for pesticides that has human health implications too. Obviously, we all know about the Austin Bat Bridge, and that brings millions of dollars every year to the city in tourist money. So that has both aesthetic and commercial value as well. If you're not familiar with Bracken Cave, it is the largest density of mammals found anywhere in the world, and that is just south of us in San Antonio. So what you're seeing here is Doppler radar of Central Texas. I can't imagine the first people that saw this and thought that there was some really weird storms blowing in. But this is actually bats that are leaving caves and culverts and bridges every evening between like April and October. These are our Brazilian free-tailed bats. They are migratory, so they're back now, but they go to Central and South America during our winter. But you can see this red circle is around Bracken Cave, where there's 20 million free-tailed bats. And this is a maternity colony. So all the females get together. They come here to raise their pups. The males go off in smaller bachelor colonies. And that's common for a lot of our dense bat species. There's other bat species, though, that are more, that don't live in large colonies. They're more singular in their living and live in trees. But just bats from that one cave, when we're talking about commercial value, eat 140 tons of insects every single night. Now, it's really hard for me to think about what 140 tons of insects looks like. So in Texas terms, can put it in the weight of F-150s. I think all of us have probably been in an F-150, and that's equivalent to the weight of about 70 F-150s. This is one cave every single night in insects. So that is a lot of weight of insects that are being preyed upon. 70 F-150s, okay, 70 in a row kind of still might be hard to think about exactly how much that is. About 280,000 Whataburgers. The estimate I don't have yet is how many Whataburgers Texans eat every day, because I think that would be interesting, but I haven't been able to find that stat yet. But that's a lot of insects. And we want it to stay that way, right? So we want bats to continue to eat a lot of these agricultural pests. However, bats in Texas and other places, unfortunately, are facing several threats. And 2 of the main threats are disease. So this is that white nose syndrome, and also wind turbines. And we have research being conducted in my lab on both of these, but most of it focuses on wind. I'll quickly give an update on white nose syndrome, though. White nose is a fungal pathogen that is found on bats, gives them often on their muzzle. So it gives them this characteristic white display on their muzzle. And basically it wakes up bats during hibernation. And as they wake up, there's not enough food or water for them, and so they basically starve to death. Now, if we think about hibernation, so I just mentioned our Brazilian free-tailed bats. They migrate, they don't hibernate. Every animal has, basically 2 options when it comes to cold weather. Get out of there or go into hibernation. So this right now, this is only affecting our hibernating bats. And so far it's not affecting our large populations of something like our Brazilian free-tailed bats. So this fungus was first detected in New York in 2007, and since then has caused 90% population level declines in 3 species in the United States, and is affecting about 13 species. It was found in Texas. The fungus was found in Texas in 2017, but just in 2020, we had our first die-off of one species called the cave myotis, where there was a lot of dead ones found here in Central Texas. And just recently, it may be on another bat species as well. So we are awaiting news on that and hoping that it's not the case, but it might be. But today we're going to talk mostly about wind turbines. So there's kind of 4 main things that focuses that my lab's been working on, which is why are bats attracted to wind turbines, how to monitor bats around wind turbines, how to deter them from wind turbines, and then just patterns of bat fatalities at wind turbines that could go into siting. So selecting the areas where wind turbines should be constructed. And again, the goal of all of this is to guide mitigation measures and reduce bat fatalities at wind farms. Not only do we want to reduce fatalities because it's good for the bats, we want to encourage development of renewable energy to battle climate change, and it's great socioeconomics for our people here. I don't know exactly what a wind turbine is going for right now, and it depends on kind of the source and the location of the turbine. But I think a lot of places, I mean, landowners can get, you know, upwards of $15,000 per turbine per year here in Texas to put these on their properties. So it's quite nice for landowners. So to begin, if you haven't heard of the issue, probably most of you have, that, you know, the unintended consequence of wind energy is bat and bird fatalities. But there's some differences there. The main difference is that bats or birds seem to be more opportunistically hit. They're just flying in an area, get hit by a wind turbine. And so it's not really, so far as we know, causing population level declines. And there's evidence of that because it's a lot of different species that are found under wind turbines. So that's just kind of like they happen to be flying in the area and get hit. However, unfortunately, there's evidence that bats actually might be attracted to wind turbines, especially certain species of bats. And this is mostly our migratory tree bats. So while white nose syndrome is mostly affecting our hibernating bats, our migrating bats are getting killed by wind turbines. And we say that because from the data that we have, which not all data is publicly available, but from the data that we have, about 3/4 of fatalities are just from 3 different species of migratory bats. And these are our more independent lone tree bat species. So it seems that those species, for some reason or another, are attracted to wind turbines. And there's been a lot of research to figure out why they might be attracted. Like, is it the lights? Is it the moving things? Is it the noise? And so far, we haven't come up with really any good solutions. You know, it could be a mix of a lot of different things, but something is likely causing them to have greater activity in this dangerous area. So that's one thing we're working on, and I'm going to circle back around to that at the end. So as I mentioned, bats might be using the wind turbines for mating aggregation. They might mistake them for roost sites. These are our tree roosting species. So maybe they see a large structure on the landscape and are like, oh, that's a big tree. Often these bats will swarm where they basically all come together for mating aggregations, and males will be on the large trees. It kind of shows their hierarchy. So again, movement of wind turbine components. But the thing that we are starting to potentially study is scent marking, and that's what we're going to come back around at the end. So the next issue is just how to monitor bats at wind turbines. So one way that we've been monitoring bats is through acoustics. So there's these acoustic detectors that can be put out, and they actually record ultrasonic frequencies. So that is the frequency of echolocation. So we can't hear a lot of echolocation. We can hear some of it. Excuse me. But most of it's ultrasonic. And these specialized microphones can record that in areas that are destined for wind farms. And this is through our U.S. Fish and Wildlife siting protocol, which are voluntary recommendations before a wind farm is built. So basically, one of the tiers of that siting protocol is to study animals and wildlife around the area. So as mentioned, bats emit ultrasonic frequencies of echolocation. So these bounce off of objects in their flight path. This is one of the programs that we use actually. So we record these on these microphones, then we can process these through different software systems, and we can actually often determine what species this is. However, not always. The echolocation call signatures often overlap for different bat species, and it takes an expert to be able to go in and do this. But this is the frequency and time of several of our species. And you can see sometimes they do have certain frequencies. So it's like a bird song, right? But they're not quite as distinct as bird songs. So often this is great for monitoring populations, but it's not fail-proof. So again, pre-construction risk surveys often put this microphone on a meteorological tower and record for a distinct amount of time before a wind farm is built. So not only can we not always tell what species it is, sometimes we can. It's better than other monitoring methods that we have. But one of the biggest issues is that we can't tell how many bats it is. So it could be one bat flying over the microphone, or just flying around in the area. We might get 1,000 calls, or it could be 1,000 bats flying over very quickly. So we can't really tell how many or bat activity in the area. We can do a proxy or an index of it for comparison, but not a nice number estimate. So another issue is that bats are not always echolocating in flight. It used to be thought that they were actually, but now new evidence shows that some species have like these tiny little calls, and they're very quiet. And other evidence is that they're not even calling all the time at all. So I mentioned that bats have a lot of communication. What we're listening typically here is for feeding buzzes. They have social calls. They have all different types of calls, just like a bird does. But we're typically the ones that are very loud that we're listening for are their feeding buzzes, but they're not always echolocating, so we don't always pick them up on the microphones. So how do we know if we're putting the wind farm in a really good area or a wind turbine in a good area if we don't have a good idea of how many bats were there? Also, I mentioned that bats likely are attracted to wind turbines. So one of the biggest pieces of evidence for that is that there tends to be greater amounts of bat activity post-construction than is monitored before using these methods. So that's one of the big issues. There seems to be more bats after, and we're trying to figure out why. So one of the things we did is thought, well, if it's not, these different reasons that bats might be attracted to wind turbines, what if we're just not monitoring them correctly? If they're not always echolocating in flight, then maybe we need a different type of monitoring system or a supplemental monitoring system. Acoustics is great. We just might want to supplement it. So we started doing that with thermal cameras, and we're watching bats fly around the wind turbines. And here we can't tell the species, but we can actually count bats, which is great. Now what you're seeing here is a 5-minute overlay of bats in the frame flying around a meteorological tower. So this is in real time. We use some machine learning and computer algorithms to be able to tell what's a bat and what's an insect. And we had these running for a while. And we were pretty good at teaching the computer what to determine was a bat versus a plane, an insect, a bird, a marker on the tower itself, with about a 95 or greater than 95% accurate of determining a bat when it was a bat. But what we found, and we've seen this in the literature a lot too, so what we're seeing here is blue is the acoustic monitoring, so this is just bat activity. So change in detection rate, but we can just think about this as kind of bat activity. And red is the thermal. So for a long time, we thought, hey, bats are most active right at sunset, or right at sunset and right before sunrise. So they come out of their roost, they're hungry, they eat, then they do their own little thing, and then they eat again before they go to sleep for the day. But that was with acoustics. And what we're seeing with the thermal cameras is actually there's a lot of bad activity in the middle of the night as well. They're just not echolocating. So our research here has supplemented the previous research that bats are not always echolocating in flight. And this is really important because if we were only using acoustics, we might not have seen this. So supplementing that for pre-surveys is helpful. It hasn't been adopted widespread yet, but we're hoping in the future that this can be supplemented so that we can get a better index of bad activity to be able to cite wind turbines. It's also really important because there's some development of smart techniques. So we have this for birds where there's actually thermal cameras that are looking for like large raptors. And if they see one, they can actually shut a wind turbine down. And they're starting to do that with bats, but it's obviously, we don't see them quite as far away. They're tiny. So they're doing that with acoustics, but we also need to know when they're being active, when they're not echolocating, because we could be shutting down wind turbines in periods where they're not as highly active, or vice versa. We're not shutting them down when they are actually highly active, but they're just not echolocating. Okay, so there's two main ways to reduce bat fatalities from wind turbines. The biggest one is curtailment. It works. You shut the wind turbines off, or they actually just changes the cut-in speed. Most wind turbines don't cut on until like 3.5 meters per second anyway, or 4.5. It depends on regulations in the area, sometimes 7 meters per second. But curtailment's basically not having a wind turbine spinning under low wind conditions, because bats don't fly when it's really hot, when it's really windy. They have a lot of activity when there's not a lot of wind. So that works. But obviously that reduces renewable energy production and that socioeconomic profit for landowners and energy companies. So we're trying to also develop bat deterrents, and we've tested one at Texas State, and we're about to test a couple more. And these deterrents were formed because bats basically, as they're echolocating, it was noted that some of their prey species, tiger moths, emit their own echolocation, and it was thought that their echolocation jams a bat's echolocation and makes it hard for them to find them. So using those same concepts, deterrents were used. So these are ultrasonic deterrents. They emit ultrasonic frequencies that are similar to a bat's echolocation call, and it's thought that it basically jams their system, their echolocation system. And if not, we don't know the exact mechanism. It might just make it a really unattractive airspace for the bat and be annoying, basically. These have been put on wind turbines, and they are still on many wind turbines. Not many relatively, but they are on some at some wind farms. Some energy companies have adopted these. And in a study here in Texas, they actually did reduce bat fatalities, but it was species dependent. So for instance, there was one species that fatalities were reduced by like 78%. Our Brazilian freetails fatalities were reduced by like 54%. But other species, it wasn't working very well at all. So we wanted to understand why. To do that, we wanted to do a controlled environment. So we built a large flight cage here at Texas State. It's about 60 meters long and 10 meters wide. And we tracked that flight movement with thermal cameras. And we emitted different treatments or different sound emissions from these deterrents to figure out which ones worked best. And we basically just built this flight cage. So it took a lot of sweat and blood to do that. It's pretty large. At the time that we developed it, it was supposed to mimic the size of a relatively normal wind turbine blade, but now wind turbine blades have gotten longer and longer. This was back in 2018-19. So these are my students and volunteers building the cage, and we have it surrounded by net so that sound can travel throughout. So we try to make it as real life as possible. And basically we capture a bat in the wild, we release it in the flight cage, and then they undergo this series of control periods with it turned off and treatment periods with it turned on. And we see through the thermal cameras what treatment is keeping bats furthest away. So here's an example where we can see the bat. This is just one thermal camera. So we had 4 and we never lost the bat in the flight cage. We could see it at all times. It's just small if I put all 4 on the screen. So this is just one, but you can see, again, we use computers to tell what is a bat and to find it. And then through that, we could tell where the bat was at any given time. And then we could get distances. And so we could compare these distances of when a turbine or when the deterrent was turned on and off, but also under the 3 different frequency emissions. So the idea is that we'd expect the bats to fly evenly throughout the flight cage when the deterrent is turned off, but then hoping that the deterrent will work and push bats far down the flight cage. And the reason we had different frequency emissions is because wind turbine blades are getting so long that these high frequency noises can't travel that far in space. So we want to find the lowest frequency that works because it'll travel further in space, but we want to make sure that it's working to deter the bats. So this is a little bit busy, but what you're seeing here, these are 5 different species in different colors, and then the average is in black. And this is the different emissions that we tested. I think, you can't see my cursor. But if you look at it, the 0 line is the black dotted line. That would be that there is no change. But you can see that all of the little squares, not all of them, but a lot of the little squares and triangles are pushed further down to the right of that black line, meaning that the deterrents were working. So it was species specific. And we're still going through some of this data and the acoustic data, but so far it looks like, for several of our species, the deterrents were working pretty well, but there were season effects. So we did this in both fall and spring, and there were sex effects. And that's really important because most bats are dying during fall migration. Migration is a 2-way process, but most are dying in the fall, not in the spring. So we need to find the solution for females being killed in the fall. So whatever is working the best for females in the fall, females because that's what's responsible for population numbers, or the ones that carry the young. One male can mate with many females. So we wanted to know what's working best for females during the fall. And so there were some seasonal and sex differences, which were really interesting, but that was our target. And you can see here the high frequency sounds were really working well for a lot of our species. However, again, they just don't travel far enough down the flight, down the wind turbine blade. So I should also mention that right now, most of these deterrents are actually put on the nacelle of the actual stalk of the wind turbine, and they're getting their energy from the wind turbine itself. But we are starting to develop blade mounted technology so they can be further out on the blade. They have not been tested yet, but one of the issues there is that wind turbine blade manufacturers and the warranty, and if the warranty is going to be voided, and how to integrate the technology into the manufacturing process. So a couple of projects I'm just going to quickly kind of go over is basically sighting. So do landscape characteristics influence fatalities? So basically, where on a broad scale, where should wind farms be constructed? And this project came out from a colleague who did her research down in South Texas. And she had 2 wind farms that were placed really close in proximity, as you can see here, but had pretty different fatality results. And they were in different habitat types. So that led us to kind of look into, well, what scale of habitat or of land cover around a wind farm? And also, what are the biggest takeaways of landscape features that we should stay away from? So we basically had different areas around a wind turbine to look at scale. Do we look at like 10 kilometers around a turbine and say, okay, this has these characteristics, it's not built here or built here. 25 kilometers, 50, how do we do that? And what we found is that somewhat unsurprisingly in South Texas, is water was really important. Water at a very broad scale. And South Texas is arid, so that makes sense. But what we also noticed that we don't think we got, we think we need to go broader in the scale, which means that bats actually might be targeting broad landscape characteristics instead of really small ones. And I think historically we've looked at more what's immediately around a wind turbine, and that might not be appropriate, especially in some of these other environments, such as arid environments, when we really need to look at 50, maybe even larger scale land cover to be able to properly site a wind farm. And then also, as I mentioned, we're also looking at patterns of bat fatalities. So where are more female fatalities occurring? We don't know much about bats. So this is where the big issue is. We don't know their migratory pathways like we do birds. We don't have good population estimates. We just can't track them. They're tiny and they fly. We don't want to put heavy transmitters on them. They're also very difficult to capture relative to some other species. And I mean, that Brazilian free-tail bat that I told you about at Bracken Cave, and it's the same one that's in the Austin Bridge. It's the fastest animal on the planet in free flight. So it can fly at over 100 miles per hour. It's been clocked in 1,000 feet in elevation foraging at that height. And so it's just really tough to know what's happening. So knowing these patterns of bat fatalities, basically we get carcasses. We have a lot of partners through different wind energy companies that send carcasses, and we're doing genetics to determine what sex it is. Because in the field, after a bat has been hit, often the carcass dries up and you can't really tell what sex it is, and they get misidentified a lot, sex and species. So here we wanted to genetically determine the sex to figure out when, again, are these females dying, because we want smart approaches. These blanket approaches are great for reducing bat fatalities, but likely not maximizing the renewable energy profits and just the renewable energy itself. So we're trying to find targeted approaches to be able to, more select for minimization. And here, what we found, again, as I mentioned, when I say fall migration, fall for a bat is about mid-July. That's when most fatalities are occurring. And it's interesting that they're not occurring in the spring when they come back, but it could be because it coincides with a lot of our bat species reproductive time period. We just don't really know. So we are definitely trying to figure that out so that we can better tackle the problem. But as you can see here, eastern red bats and hoary bats, this is 2 of the 3 species that comprise 75% of the fatalities, the 2 biggest species. And you can see that the proportion of females actually drops off as we go through the year. So again, important because we want to target minimization strategies to the females while maximizing our energy production. Okay, so back to that earlier slide where I said olfaction and scent marking. One of my students found that this is again at that meteorological tower using the thermal cameras, and this is 3 consecutive nights. And what he found was bats are approaching the wind turbine on 3 consecutive nights in very different ways. Again, this is 5-minute overlays of bat activity, and we can see up in the top left one, they're coming in from the left. Middle one, they're just kind of everywhere, and then they're coming in from the right. So we looked at the wind vanes, which are on these guy wires, and it looks like they're coming from the leeward direction. So they're actually coming from downwind. So it made us think, are they scent marking the towers? Like maybe these are navigational cues for migration? We have no idea. And likely, again, their bats are probably using a lot of different ways or a lot of different cues to focus in on the wind turbines. We also found that when there was one bat in the frame, they kind of flew around haphazardly, but as soon as another bat flew into the area, they started targeting one location. So we don't know if they were scent marking to tell each other information about each other, such as, sex, species, reproductive capacity, no idea, but the behavior did seem to change. So we thought that was really interesting. And we know a lot of mammals use olfactory cues to communicate a lot of this information. So obviously bats do as well. So this is me in the smaller flight cage releasing a bat. This was a few years ago. We started a preliminary study. These bags hanging have different bat pheromones in there that we collected from bats themselves, urine, feces, skin swabs. And we were trying to figure out, hey, are they flying towards one or the other? Unfortunately, we think that this flight cage was just a little small. They were only in here for a few minutes, and then I captured them very easily. So you have to remember, it's dark in here. I can't see. This is near infrared. So it looks like it's light for y'all, but it's very, very dark for me. So we very nicely capture them in a net and release them at the site of capture after just a few minutes. But we want to start doing some of this research at a larger scale to see if that could be contributing to bat attraction. Because if so, all of this knowledge just helps us figure out how to keep bats away from wind turbines, maximizing renewable energy and across Texas. So I think probably a lot of y'all know about some of these organizations, and this is just wildlife, back to wildlife in general. If it's not bats, if I haven't convinced you that bats are absolutely amazing and deserve everything that we have to give them, there's a lot of organizations focused on um, other taxa as well. Likely, I know with this crowd, y'all probably know about a lot of these, but that's ways you can help. And of course, if you haven't heard about RAWA, that is one of the biggest pieces of legislation ever for conservation. We haven't gotten it's bipartisan, right? And it could bring billions of dollars to wildlife conservation. So if you haven't heard of RAWA or Recovering America's Wildlife Act, again, probably a lot of y'all have, but if not, look into it and try to get our local representatives on board because it would do amazing. Currently, still a lot of our wildlife research and conservation dollars comes from hunters and fishermen, which is fantastic, except for they are decreasing in numbers. And I don't know as in the next 10 years how many hunters there's going to be, but we need to find another funding mechanism. So that's a great way to support our local wildlife. And I'm going to stop there with another one of my favorite quotes from Ida Leopold, which is one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to the layman. So it's something I think a lot of people can drive around and think, well, hey, wind turbines, that's amazing. And I'm pro wind, I'm pro renewable energy. But sometimes it's hard not to think, oh, how many bats are under that wind turbine? Hopefully less in the future as we conduct more research. And again, thanks for having me.